Hey, welcome everybody to Theology Thursday. Unfortunately, tonight's episode could not be live. I was super bummed. I've gotten really used to doing them live, and I really enjoy doing them live and being able to interact with you guys in real time. What happened this week is just we had a last minute need to fill a spot on the worship team. So we film worship sets at the same time that I do Theology Thursday. So for me to be able to jump in and help out necessitated me pre-recording this particular lesson. So this will be pre-recorded. Next week we'll be back to live as usual. We have a really, as I've been talking about, a really heavy and in many ways difficult discussion that we're doing tonight, going over a couple of the incommunicable attributes of God. And so I just want to tell you up front, because I'm not able to answer your questions live right now, please put them in the comments. Next week is our final incommunicable attributes week, and it's much easier. There's less content, so I actually am going to have more time than usual to respond to questions. So as I'm going through the material today, I want to encourage you, ask your questions, throw them in the comments, or send them to me in an email or whatever if you don't want to do it publicly for whatever reason. And I'll have plenty of time next week to address those at the beginning of the episode and kind of go back over stuff from today that's either confusing or troubling to you or that you have questions about. So if you got questions, ask them in the comments, send me an email, send me a text message, whatever, because I'd love to interact about this stuff. I think what we're covering today, even though, as I said, it's difficult and heavy, it's also incredibly significant and important and often neglected things about God. And so, let's get into it. This is week 2 of our Theology Proper series. Theology Proper, of course, is just theology about God himself. And so it's we've been calling the series God because that's really what it is. And as I said last week, a kind of unexamined theology proper, having assumptions, assumed theological beliefs about God that you don't examine and don't know can cause real problems down the road. And this is probably the week where some of that might start to emerge. Now, a little bit of review of last week that's necessary because much of this stuff kind of builds on itself. Many of God's incommunicable attributes are related to one another. They're corollaries of each other. And so that is the case this week for sure. So a couple of quick kind of review things here on these incommunicable attributes. One of them actually is this word incommunicable. Just in case you forgot, communicable attributes are those attributes of God that he communicates to others, that he shares with others. Things like holiness, love, righteousness, ways that we could be like God, potentially, at least to imitate those traits. Obviously not to the same extent that God is, but we can be righteous, loving, holy, etc. Incommunicable attributes are the ways in which God is not like us. And this is, as we talked about last week, thinking of God from the top down rather than the bottom up. We don't just want to create God in our image and, kind of think of him as like a super version of a human being. God is categorically different from us in many ways, and those ways are described in theology as his incommunicable attributes. So the ones that we looked at last week are God's incomprehensibility and perfection. Incomprehensibility is potentially a misleading sounding word. It doesn't mean that God is not understandable at all to us. What it means is that there are limits to our ability to understand and describe God. So the majority of our time last week was spent explaining why that is the case. You can go back and watch that video if you want details. But the crux of it is that we as finite beings cannot possibly fully understand or describe an infinite God. We would have to be his equal to fully understand him. So we start the task of theology proper with the kind of requisite amount of humility and honesty about that. And so the cool thing that we talked about last week is that just because we can't fully understand God doesn't mean that we can't truly understand God. And because God has chosen to reveal himself to us, we can know him truly as he really is, just not exhaustively. And then finally, we talked about the fact that God doesn't just want us to know about him, but to actually know him, to have a personal, loving relationship with him as our Father. And then we finished with a fairly brief description of God's perfection. It's a trait that's going to come up more than once. But we used Anselm of Canterbury's definition of perfection, which is that God is a being than which no greater can be conceived. It's a wonderfully medieval sounding way to define it, but the key there is that it's not just that God is better than us. He is better than anything that a mind can possibly conceive of. whatever the greatest thing you can conceive of is, God is, by definition, that. He cannot be improved upon. We talked about the creator-creature distinction, the fact that God has, well, we'll get more into that today, so we don't have to dive into it right now. But the point is, God's perfection and God's kind of infinitude, his eternality, these things about him, is that he cannot be improved upon. He cannot get better in any way because of his perfection. Nothing can be conceived of that's greater than him. Certain incommunicable traits logically flow from this. And those are some of the things we're going to get into today. The first one is a fancy Latin word. This is pronounced aseity. I think it's aseity. I just said it's pronounced that way, but I realized as I was saying that I've pretty much only ever heard it or ever seen it written down. So hopefully it's aseity and not aseity. I don't know. Maybe it's aseity. The aseity is, I put the kind of like words that define what that means underneath it. One kind of giant caveat at the beginning of this. I'm going to pretty frequently use interchangeable terms for some of these theological categories. I'm always going to tell you what the technical like theology nerd term is, but I'm also going to use the more like commonly understandable words. And so feel free, whatever kind of works best for your brain. You do not need to remember the word aseity. You don't have to remember the word incomprehensibility. As we go, just whatever works best for your brain. So aseity means, I think that is how you say it, because clearly I'm saying it that way. Aseity means God's independence or self-existence. Aseity is a Latin word that means out of self. And so self-existence or independence is a great way to understand this term. And what it means at the core is that God is not caused by anything else, and he is not dependent upon anything else for his existence other than himself. He is entirely self-caused, self-moved, self-motivated. He's not contingent on any other being, any other process for his initial existence or his ongoing existence. He is entirely self-existent. And that seems extremely obvious when you say it that way, but we have like nothing else in human experience that is even remotely similar to that. Everything in our experience is contingent. You are contingent upon, oh my gosh, countless factors, really obvious things like your parents, but the kind of chain of contingency, the chain of causality that goes back from your existence, initial and ongoing, is just infinite. You could, well, it's not infinite, but it's gigantic. And the idea of God's aseity is that God is at the very beginning of that great causal chain, that great chain of contingencies. And he is the only being that is entirely non-contingent. He exists in a fully independent existence. The way that Wayne Grudem, the theologian, defines aseity is that God does not need us or the rest of creation for anything. But then he guards against a possible misunderstanding by saying, yet we and the rest of creation can glorify him and bring him joy. So the second half of that is meant to guard against a potential misunderstanding. Let me say it again. God does not need us or the rest of creation for anything, yet we and the rest of creation can glorify him and bring him joy. So let's unpack that a little bit. This is a great verse that describes God's aseity. This is from Job. Just in case you're wondering, yes, we're using this in its appropriate context. This is God speaking and describing himself. We talked a lot in our hermeneutic series about anytime you quote from Job, double check that you're quoting somebody who's trustworthy, because there's a lot of voices that you shouldn't believe in that book. But this is God speaking and talking about himself to Job. And he says, who has first given to me that I should repay him? Whatever is under the whole heaven is mine. And this is getting at the idea that Jesus himself says in the book of John that God is life in himself. He doesn't need to receive anything from anyone else. He is, and this is another quote from Anselm, the same guy who gave us our definition of perfection, a philosopher and theologian from the medieval era. Anselm said that God is that which exists through itself and through which all other things exist. And so this means, again, I know I keep saying it over and over, but we really want to just drill it in. God's existence, initial and ongoing, is dependent upon no one and nothing. No process, no person, no being. The Creator has life in himself, and the creature receives life from the Creator. This is part of that creator-creature distinction that we talked about. And that's a gigantic and fundamental difference between God and his creation. The Creator is life, has life in himself, and the creature must receive life from God. And so that means that God is the only and final self-existent being. He never came into being, and he's independent from his creation. And this is a really big difference between Christianity and entire sets of pantheist and panentheist religious beliefs. Pantheism is the belief that everything in creation is God. Panentheism is slightly different, and well, it's very different. But the panentheist believes that God is infused into all of creation, and so it's a very close identification between the creation and the Creator. But in Christianity, the doctrine of aseity helps us to understand that God is not one with the created order. He is distinct from it. In fact, he's Lord over it. And there's not kind of a mutual relationship between God and his creation. God gives life to all of his creatures and all of his creation, and does not need to receive anything from them for his own existence. A metaphor we could use for this is the sun. We'll probably come back to this metaphor more than once. The sun has enormous impact on the world that we live in. It warms everything. It causes plants to grow. It gives us, as a human being, it gives you your vitamin D. Again, it makes your garden grow. It makes a cold world warm up. But the sun is distinct from the earth and doesn't need anything from the earth. I'm not a scientist, so I don't know if that's 100% true. But you get the picture, right? We receive light. We receive warmth from the sun. The sun has an incredible way of acting upon everything that it touches. So I walk outside and my cold skin warms up. I have this kind of infusion of the impact of the sun, but the sun remains entirely distinct from me. This is kind of what the aseity relationship that God has with his creation is like. Now here's where the rubber meets the road for us kind of emotionally and psychologically, and this is where it can get difficult for people. And I'll just say it really bluntly. Aseity teaches that God does not need you. And this is very obvious when you start to unpack it, but at the basic level, it can be intuitively challenging to us, because many of us have kind of internalized the idea that God created the world at some point because he was lonely, or he was in some way incomplete. He needed something. He needed companionship. He needed somebody to love him and care for him the way that he loves and cares for everybody else. And many of us have heard this directly or have said it. If so, forgive yourself. The point isn't to feel guilty. It's just to become more informed of our understanding of God. But the most likely thing is that you've actually never heard anyone say this, but you've again kind of internalized it at some level. And that some part of you believes that God needs you for something and created you because of some insufficiency in himself. And so we just want to shine a spotlight on the fact that you might think that and tell you, man, according to a proper orthodox theology of God, that just could not be further from the truth. Let's look at some Bible to get an idea of this. There's one really dramatic example of this. This comes from Paul's sermon that he gives to the Athenians. He's standing on the Areopagus telling a bunch of learned men the truth about God. And one of the things he says, I wish we had time to talk about the whole sermon. It's one of my favorite parts of the New Testament. But one of the things he said is, the God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything. And he goes on from there. But you get the idea. Paul's speaking to a Greek crowd, and it already tells us earlier in this chapter that Paul has already walked through Athens and seen all of the temples and idols that they have. Athens had a reputation for just an incredible number of idols. There's a quote from an ancient Greek historian who says that you're more likely to bump into an idol than another man when you're in Athens. That's how incredibly dense with idols that city is, or was. And so Paul is saying, unlike all of your conceptions of God, who you think you have to, go to the temple and bring him food or burn incense or do something to make him happy, God doesn't need anything from you. He doesn't need service from human hands. He doesn't need anything. And not only does he not need anything, let's look at this again. It's beautiful. Verse 25 says, "Nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." That's a pretty comprehensive statement. Not only does he not need anything from you, he in fact gives you and the rest of creation everything that you need. This is a one-sided relationship in terms of needs being met. Another one is Psalm 50. There's things like this are all over the Psalms, but this is just one good example of it. Psalm 50 we'll go to verse 9. God says, "I will not accept a bull from your house or goats from your folds." Why? Now he's talking about the unworthiness of their sacrifice, but part of his explanation is to say, "For every beast of the forest is mine, the cattle on 1,000 hills. I know all the birds of the hills, and all that moves in the field is mine." I love this. "If I were hungry, I would not tell you, for the world and its fullness are mine." So God goes, listen, I'm not accepting your sacrifices because of reasons that he talks about in the other parts of the psalm. But then he wants to clarify, and by the way, I don't need them anyway. I'm not up here hungry when I'm not getting your sacrifices. I don't want them right now, and I'm not missing out on anything when you don't give them to me. And that's already starting to hint at what we're going to get to in a second. That God, what the things that we do for God are ultimately about reflecting back to God the good things he's given us for our benefit. God doesn't need them from you. Let's look at one more, because I think this is really crucial for us to kind of get our minds around. This is from Paul's letter to the Romans, 11:34, not 24. Paul says, "Oh, the depths of the riches and wisdom and knowledge of God. How unsearchable are his judgments and how inscrutable his ways." Side note, that's speaking to the incomprehensibility of God. He's going, God's goodness and wisdom and knowledge and judgments are just beyond our understanding. That's what this word inscrutable is getting at. It's something that you can't fully understand, or it's not apparent to you. And then he beautifully just kind of breaks into poetry here, and he's half kind of quoting from prophets and other parts of the Old Testament. He says, "For who has known the mind of the Lord, or who has been his counselor, or who has given a gift to him that he might be repaid? For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory forever. Amen." That's beautiful. And again, he's making the same point as all of that other stuff we saw. Paul's saying, no one's given God a gift that would make God owe anyone anything. God isn't up there needing something from you. And so it's just absolutely crucial that we wrap our heads around the fact that God is not a needy God. God's not up there wringing his hands over your problem, over your kind of indecisions, over your inability to serve him perfectly. He's not going like, I just really need Sam to get it together. God is not needy. God has always, for all of existence, I was going to say before, but that's, God, it's not even before, because this is logically prior to the creation of time. For all of eternity, God has existed in a state of perfect fellowship in which nothing is needed within the Trinity. Jesus alludes to that. Let's look at it. John 17. Jesus says, as part of his high priestly prayer in the book of John, "And now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed." He says something similar later, down here, verse 24. "Father, I desire that they also," talking about the disciples, "that they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you have given me, because you loved me before the foundation of the world." And what this is hinting at is that before the creation of anything, there was already love and satisfaction and joy and fellowship and perfect fulfillment within the Trinity. God, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, this is a deep and profound mystery, have existed in perfect fellowship and relationship for all of eternity. And so God, again, is not up there wringing his hands going like, I need to create some people so that I can stop being so lonely. I'm not going to look at some of these other examples because I think the point is made, but just know that the Old Testament is going to affirm over and over again that God is the owner and ruler of everything, that he is dependent upon nothing, and that he gives everything out. I can show you more verses if you want those, so reach out to me. But he doesn't come to humanity desperate for anything, not even love. He gives everything, including the ability and desire to love him. So that can sound like bad news, but it's really, really not. You want a God who is that great. And the truth is, the beautiful thing is, God, even though he is independent, still chose to create us. And he does truly love us, and we can truly love him back and bring him joy. And the beautiful thing about that, the reason why once you kind of can truly fully conceive of this, it's more beautiful because his love for you, because of his aseity, is actually truly unconditional. Meaning he's not loving you because you're lovable. He's loving you because he chose to. He's not loving you because he needs your love back. He's loving you because he decided in his infinite wisdom and righteousness to love you. And that's absolutely beautiful. And so for us to glorify and serve God isn't to give God something that we have and he doesn't, or to give him something that he desperately needs or otherwise wouldn't have, right? It's to return to him a portion of what he has given us. It's like when your children share or when your children give you something. I mean, this is, like every metaphor, this is imperfect, but have you ever given, those of you who are parents or who have, nieces and nephews or whatever, how many of you have given a child, a little tiny child, food? Like you made dinner, you put the plate in front of them, and that moment when they share something from it with you is still incredibly beautiful. You know what I mean? So when my daughter decides, rarely, we're working on sharing right now, when my daughter decides to offer me something from her plate, usually it's like something she doesn't really want, but there's still something so sweet about that. She'll hold it out to me and say like, Dada, do you want this? And I feel the love from that. Even though I'm not like, my response is not to be, even as a human, a fallen human, my response is not to be like, Ellie, like I gave you that bread and I've got way more bread in the fridge and I'm not even hungry. I already ate my dinner. So no, I don't want your bread crust. I gave that to you. Are you kidding me? No, I feel joy and pleasure from her desire to share with me, even when she's sharing with me something that I gave to her in the first place. And that's what it's like for us to glorify God. It doesn't mean he doesn't care about us, or we can't make any difference. We can bring God joy because he has chosen to have that relationship with us in his infinite wisdom. Here's a couple verses that show that. This is kind of, the beautiful side of what we just looked at. The most famous one is in Isaiah 62. Whoop. Not 23, 3. My typing fingers are all crazy today. This is one of the beautiful kind of positive turns in Isaiah where he talks about, kind of the ultimate future, the realized people of God. And he says of that future people of God, you shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord and a royal diadem, a jewel, a crown in the hand of your God. You shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate, but you shall be called, my delight is in her, and your land married. For Yahweh delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your sons marry you, and as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. I mean, those of you who are married know, and even those of you who aren't married can understand, it's hard to think of a more intimate and loving image than the one that is used all over the Bible of God as a husband and his people as his bride. But in that passage, the language is that loving and beautiful. He says, God will rejoice over you the way a groom rejoices over his bride. I mean, I picture the moment 10 years ago, believe it or not, when my wife, Christina, the day she became my wife, when she came walking down the aisle, and it was, this is my bride, this is the person I'm marrying today. I mean, I could cry right now if I leaned into what I'm feeling right now, right? And God, in infinite measure, says, he's not just cross-armed, independent because of his aseity, saying like, I don't care about you, whatever, take it or leave it. No, he says, I choose to rejoice over you in that same way, but in even greater measure. It's beautiful. There's a couple more. It's a Psalm. Man, see, my typing is just out of control. Psalm 147, not 141. Verse 11. It says, but Yahweh takes pleasure in those who fear him, in those who hope in his steadfast love, in his covenant faithfulness is what that means. Let's jump to the New Testament and look at another one here. The author of Hebrews says, without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. But the kind of obvious implication there is without faith it's impossible to please him would indicate that with faith it is possible to please God, to give God joy. Even more direct, just in kind of terms of love, 1 John 3, not John 3, but 1 John 3. See what kind of love the Father has given to us that we should be called children of God, and so we are. And again, this is similar to that image before, but it's just another way of looking at it. He talked about being a groom and us being the bride, and now he says it's like a father looking at his children with love. 1 John 3:16, by the way, not John 3:16, but 1 John 3:16, also worthy of memorization, says, by this we know love, that he laid down his life for us, and we ought to lay down our lives for our brothers. And so John, and we could find verse after verse like this, but the point is God has chosen that we will be meaningful to him, that he will receive joy from us, that he will delight in us, not because we are inherently delightful, but because God chose to love us in that way. And that's better. That's good news for someone like me who is not worthy of love all the time, right? To know that God's love for me doesn't rest on my worthiness of love, but on his eternal decision to love me. And I think that should bring us humility and gratitude and cause us to view our relationship with God with a greater sense of stability. All right, we got to keep going because we got another characteristic to cover. This is a beautiful quote about God's aseity from John Calvin. No drop will be found either of wisdom and light, or of righteousness or power or rectitude, or of genuine truth, which does not flow from him, and of which he is not the cause. Beautiful. And this we're going to reference it over and over again, and I've said this about God's perfection as well, but God's aseity is a foundational attribute from which many others flow, including this next one. And hang in there because we're going to dive another level of kind of difficulty. We're going to talk about God's unchangeableness. The technical term for this is God's immutability, which we'll talk about first. And then there's a more highly debated corollary to that that's called impassibility that we'll get to in a minute. But immutability, it just means, mutable just means changeable. So immutable literally just means unchangeable. That's the whole point. So this is an example of one of those ones where if you don't remember the word immutability, that's fine. Just remember that God is unchangeable. And what this means, the kind of technical definition, I'll read it actually, is God is unchanging in his being, perfections, purposes, and promises. Yet God does act and feel emotions, and he acts and feels differently in response to different situations. Even within that definition, there's controversy, just so you know. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. But God being unchanging, for me, this is the simplest way to conceive of this. It is the difference between being and becoming. God is not becoming anything. We always are. We are constantly becoming something different than we were 1 minute ago. God is not. And again, this is an incommunicable attribute, so it is like by definition something that's hard for us to relate to. Let's look at just a quick verse that talks about this. Psalm 102:25. Of old you laid the foundation of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will remain. They will wear out like a garment, but you will change them like a robe, and they will pass away. But you are the same, and your years have no end. So everything else changes. That's the point of that. There's a lot of verses that say similar things. Everything else changes, and you don't. And so the logic of this, that's very simple to grasp, in my opinion, when it comes to God's immutability, is that if God changes, he, by definition, cannot be perfect. And just here's the logic. For God to get worse, that one's really obvious. God gets worse, he's not perfect. But even if God were to get better, if God were to improve in any minuscule way, it will mean that prior to that improvement, he was not perfect. There was a deficiency before that change. So any change in any qualitative direction, whether it's better or worse, breaks God's perfection entirely. So the very concept of a God a being greater than whom nothing can be imagined, as Anselm said, requires that God doesn't change. Otherwise, at some point, you could imagine a better version of him, and he's no longer perfect. He does not decrease, he does not increase. God does not have, this is a nerdier way to describe what we're talking about, God does not have potentiality. And Again, this has to do with becoming. For human beings, we have potentiality. We can become better or worse. We can change qualitatively throughout our lives, day to day, hour to hour. God does not have potential. So God is not perfect because at some point he reached his potential of perfection. God is perfect because he is perfection itself. The quality of perfection isn't just something God has, it's something he actually is. So he's not becoming anything, he's not reaching any potential, he is exactly what he is. And we talked about this with aseity already, but God is the first and only, what the old philosophers called unmoved mover. He's the beginning of the regressive chain of moved movers who are impacted by other things. Thomas Aquinas talks about how God is the beginning of the regression of causes. So what caused this, what caused that, what caused that? At the very end of that is a God who is not caused. And because he has aseity, because he's not caused by anything, he always is and has been exactly what he is and does not change. And that has really positive benefits for us. James talks about it like this. This is, again, a very famous passage. James 1, verse 17. James is talking about being steadfast in the midst of trials and how trials can actually benefit you and grow you. And he says, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights. We're very familiar with that part. But then he says, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. So James roots God's trustworthiness, the fact that you can trust in his goodness and the goodness of his gifts, in the fact that he does not change. Why? Why would that be the reason? The truth is you can always trust God to remain good. Again, that sounds kind of obvious, but in the midst of trials, you might find yourself, as part of what the book of Job that our current series is on. It's like in the midst of difficulties and trials, like James is talking about, you can wonder what God's motives are. But James says you can trust that he always has your good in mind, specifically because he does not change. You're not going to do something that's going to cause him to go, you know what? Never mind. I'm not going to be for this guy's good anymore. God always has your good in mind and will always act in a way that reflects his perfect goodness, even in the midst of the kind of trials that James has been talking about. It's incredibly good news, and we'll continue to explore why it's such good news as we go on. Now, here's the big possible misunderstanding with immutability. The idea that God does not change can lead us to think on an intuitive level that God therefore cannot or does not act. That immutability makes God like immobile, that immutability equals immobility or something like that. And it simply doesn't. And there are pre-Christian theologians who conceived of an incredibly strong version of immutability in that sense. That's actually how Aristotle thought that God would be. Aristotle talked about a God who was so immutable that he did not change in any sense, did not move at all. He was incredibly rigid. And he talked about his conception of God, which was also an unmoved mover in his language, as a God who is utterly without change, like a beautiful statue, but who causes change in other things simply by being an object of desire, is how he said it. So it's like, just the only thing that changes you about God is when you behold his perfections. He doesn't actually do anything. You just have to look at him and it will cause you to change. That's Aristotle's view. This is, pre-Christian, right? Now, that is not the way that God's changeless nature is described in Scripture or defined in Christian theology. Immutability does not mean immobility. It doesn't mean monotony. God is active and dynamic. He's perfectly active and dynamic and vibrant. He's described that way over and over in Scripture. The point of immutability is that he does not need to be acted upon in order to become those things. Meaning, you don't do something that causes him to be dynamic. Something doesn't happen to him that causes him to move into action. He always was and always is perfectly active and dynamic and vibrant. So it doesn't mean, again, it doesn't mean he doesn't act, doesn't mean he doesn't respond, it means he doesn't change. And when he acts and when he responds, it's perfectly in alignment, perfectly in accord with his immutable nature and his eternal will. Now, this is where it gets really abstract, and we're starting to kind of brush up against a doctrine that we're not really even going to dive into about God as what Thomas Aquinas called pure act. But here's the part of that is worth knowing. and this is kind of my general conception of it, that God's actions in time are always based on his eternal divine action that, is outside of time and therefore not dependent on the things that he appears to be responding to. So he's always acting in accord with his perfect will for all of eternity, even though that can appear on the human level to be a direct response to something that we did or said. And so the question that comes from that, and that kind of idea answers is, well, doesn't the Bible describe God as changing his mind all the time? There's one particularly famous example of this in 1 Samuel 15, where God is removing the kingship from King Saul, and it says both, uses the same word. It says God regretted having made Saul king. It says it more than once. Then after that, it says, let's look at it. It's 1 Samuel 15. Got to show you guys, right? 1 Samuel 15, let's see down here, verse 20. Oh, wait, no. Before that. Yeah. Okay, come on. Where are you? I'm going to find it. Oh, yeah. Okay, so it's right here at the very end. 29. So he's already said, I'm not going to keep looking for it. I don't know why I can't find it, but it talks about how God regrets having made Saul king. But then Samuel tells Saul, the Lord has torn the kingdom of Israel from this day and has given it to this neighbor of yours who is better than you. And also the glory of Israel, meaning God, will not lie or have regret. It's the exact same word that he just said, that the text just said God had about Saul. For he's not a man that he should have regret. But at the end of the chapter, it says again, Samuel did not see Saul again until the day of his death, but Samuel grieved over Saul, and the Lord regretted that he had made Saul king over Israel. Now, there are other examples like this, but this is the strongest one. And so here's the kind of short version. And again, this could be, just discussing this could be an entire video. But if you believe in God's omniscience, that God knows everything at all times, then him having what we in human experience think of as regret can't possibly be the case. And again, God says right here in the passage that God won't have regret. And so the shortest answer to this is that God is regularly, as we talked about last week, using kind of anthropomorphic imagery to help us understand something that's not understandable. And so he's speaking in human terms to human beings about what he's experiencing at a level that we can't possibly understand. John Calvin, as we said before, says it's like God speaking baby talk to us. But the deeper level of this that has to do with God as kind of pure act, as always acting in accordance with his eternal will, is this. God's present at any present moment from the human level, because God is eternal, but at a present moment on the human level, God's attitudes and intentions are portrayed with respect to the situation that exists at that moment. So what's happening right now, God's actions, God's feelings and intentions are going to be portrayed in relation to that event that's happening. And so when situations change, God's attitude changes with them, but not because of them. God's attitude will change with the situation according to his eternal will from outside of time, but not in response to them. So those changes are preordained along with the events that they correspond to, but they're not being changed because of that. Meaning, at the moment that Saul defies God's will and God chooses to remove the kingship from him, God's response to that situation perfectly matches what a perfect and righteous God would and should do and feel in that situation. But he's not doing it because Saul caused him to. He's doing it because he has eternally willed that he would respond rightly to situations like that. So again, this is incredibly deep, and we could spend a whole hour unpacking that, and I wish you guys were here in the chat live so that we could go back and forth about whether that's making sense. But I'll just say it one more time. God has always, for all of eternity, acted in the perfect way, in the perfectly righteous way, relative to any situation that comes. He has willed that he would respond righteously to everything. And so from the human perspective, this looks like change, but it's actually part of God's eternal act. And so it's actually funny. Isaac and I were just talking yesterday about this tweet. This theologian and professor tweeted, "I don't think I want to worship a God whose mind I might succeed in changing." And he's kind of getting at the reason why this is good news, that you can't change God's mind and that God doesn't change his mind. For you to be able to talk God into or out of something gives you an incredible amount of power over God and weakens God incredibly. And again, and this is the key, this is how you have to resolve tensions within the Bible. The ways that God is described in tons of verses we already looked at in the first half hour today necessitate a God who already knows what's going to happen, who already knows how he's going to respond and act in any given situation, and therefore a God who can't be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm so surprised that Saul did that, and now I wish I hadn't done what I did." And it's anthropomorphic, human-level imagery used to help us understand something that is beyond our understanding. Okay, that complicated enough? We're going to go a level more difficult. Not necessarily technically, but potentially emotionally for some of us. Now, we're not going to dive all the way deep into impassibility because it's a gigantic debate, and it's not something that's 100% settled. And so I'll kind of tell you what the part of it that is for the most part settled and what my opinion is. But the idea of impassibility is actually really close to what it sounds like. It means that God does not have passions. God is not subject to passions. And if you think as a point of comparison about the Greek gods, all of the stories you've heard about Thor and Zeus and Hermes and Aphrodite and all these other gods, the Greek gods were very human. They're very scandalous. They do stuff that sounds a lot like us. They're fickle. They do change their mind all the time. They consort with human beings. They commit every type of wrongdoing that you could possibly imagine. And they can get furious. They can get angry. They can get upset and disappointed. They can freak out on people. They're emotional, exactly like human beings are. They depend on humans to satisfy their needs, like we talked about before. God doesn't. And whether it's to expend their lust on human beings or to satisfy hunger, they need people, and they have these gigantic emotional reactions to what people do. And that would be described by theologians as passible. They have emotions that change them. They have emotions that impact them. They are at the mercy of their passions, just like you and I are. That's incredibly common to the human experience. God, by comparison, is described in classical theism as impassible. And that means one who is without those types of passions. Now, this has to do, again, with God's completeness, his perfection, the fact that he's not becoming anything. There's nothing yet to be about him. He's already complete. And so all of the debate in impassibility centers around the limits of this characteristic. There are incredibly strong versions that are argued for by really brilliant theologians that basically say God does not feel emotion on the level or in any way similar to what humans do. And so they talk about, God's kind of emotional portrayals in the Bible as anthropomorphic. I don't personally go that far. Some brilliant theologians do. Here's the key. Here's what I think good theology proper must affirm about God, or ought to affirm about God. The point is that God is not susceptible to emotional swings. He's in complete control over who and what he is, what he does, and how he feels. So he doesn't have passions in the human sense, because what God feels isn't determined by what you and I made him feel. He feels the right thing that he ought to feel, the thing that he eternally willed that he would feel in a given situation. So I do believe personally that God does feel emotions in some way that's different than the way that we do, but they're they are the true and right and righteous emotions that he ought to feel, rooted in his nature and his will and his decision, part of his eternal divine action. They're not dependent on or in response to us. We don't act upon him in a way that causes him to feel something that he didn't choose to feel. And so again, kind of guarding against the misunderstanding, it doesn't mean that he's indifferent to the world. It doesn't mean that he's apathetic and doesn't care. It just means that he's not causally dependent upon us for his feelings or his emotions or responses. And so it's incredibly important with all of these theological categories like immutability and impassibility to remember that they are negative descriptors. They're saying what God is not. They're not making a comprehensive statement about what God is. It doesn't mean that God is indifferent or detached. It just means that he doesn't change, and he can't be made to change by an outside force. And so God is merciful, he's loving, he's compassionate, and impassibility teaches us that he's not that way because of something that someone else did. And this is similar to the point I made earlier about immutability, but it's beautiful and encouraging. God's love for you is a virtue, not a passion. You see the difference? He doesn't look at you and go like, look how cute he is. I just love him. And you don't want him to do that, by the way, because the day that you're not so cute, his love for you might change. But if God's love for you is rooted in his eternal divine will, he has chosen righteously to love you, then man, that is an incredibly safe love that we have no human analogy for, frankly. He can't be more loving and merciful than he already is. You can't make him love you more than he already does, because his love for you is part of his divine will. I know I keep saying stuff like that over and over again, but it's because it's so counterintuitive, and I want you just to continue to kind of wrestle with it. So one more time. Impassibility does not mean that God is inert. It doesn't mean he's static. In my opinion, it doesn't mean that he's emotionless or like aloof and apathetic. It means that his love for you is so maximally alive, so fully and completely enacted in the world that he can't become more loving to you than he already is and has been eternally. And that, even though, again, it's counterintuitive and it might feel bad at first, I'm convinced that that is so much better to be loved by a God who loves you because of his decision to love you in all perfection and eternity, rather than how he feels about you at a given moment. Because I don't know about you, but I am not super lovable all the time. This is from a theologian named Paul Helm. He says, when God is faced with the knowledge of certain creaturely actions, he invariably acts in a way that is appropriate to that action, given the divine purpose, and so appears to the creature to react. That's complex, but that's kind of what I've been trying to get at over and over here, is that God, when he sees what you do, he acts and responds in a way that is appropriate to that action for all eternity. And so it appears like he's reacting to you, but he is in fact doing the right and righteous thing at any given time. Now, we're going to wrap up here. And I want to encourage you, I have a couple more things to say, but I want to encourage you, ask the questions that you have, because these are doctrines that invariably lead to big reactions and big questions. And I want to take time to address some of those next week, and I have time to do that. So shoot me emails, text messages, make YouTube comments, but wrestle with it and ask the questions that you have. But I want to finish by talking about why I believe that God's unchangeableness is incredibly good news for human beings, and particularly in situations like the situations that we're in right now: global pandemic, lockdown, emotional anxiety and depression, racial tensions, injustices, all of the brutal and horrible things we've been seeing and experiencing lately. The world has set so much of what it values on incredibly shaky ground. Not even just shaky ground, like an absolutely baseless quicksand. We are, as a culture, deeply committed to certain ideas and values without any roots, without any reasons why we think them. And so we talked about this a couple weeks ago when I talked about race and theology. We believe racism is wrong as a culture, that injustice is wrong as a culture, that abuse of power is wrong as a culture, but we have no reasons why we think that. Our whole world can't tell you at bottom. They tell you what you should think, but not why you should think that. And so that's why throughout history, cultures swing on morality and ethics. They go back and forth between what they value, because there's no grounding, there's no roots. And when your morals and your values are on sand, man, of course they're going to shift and change without warning or without notice. It's terrifying. You can't possibly be prepared for what could come next. Christians, by comparison, have an anchor. And this is biblical language. Let's look at Hebrews. It's a famous verse. I actually have an anchor on my arm because of this verse. I'll read it in its entirety. It says, "For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, 'Surely I will bless you and multiply you.' And thus Abraham, having waited patiently, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we have fled for refuge. We who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor for the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus is gone as forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order or pattern of Melchizedek." Now, I love those 7 verses more than I can even tell you, and I could, if I'm not careful, I will accidentally talk for another 50 minutes just about those. I want to really focus on how God's immutability impacts this. He talks about these two unchangeable things upon which our hope rests, and they are God's promise and God's purpose in his oath, and the character of God, which is holy, and the fact that God does not lie. And so, therefore, his announcement of his promise, when God makes a promise to Abraham, and when God makes a promise to you and I, we can be absolutely double sure, because God's oath and God's promise are both rooted in a God who does not lie and does not change. And so the stability of your faith as a Christian rests upon this anchor of an unchanging God. And what an image, an anchor. The storms are raging. The ship is being tossed back and forth, but you will not move because you are anchored to a God who does not change, who cannot be acted upon, who cannot be made to change his mind by manipulation or bullying or anything. He cannot be made to change once he's made a promise to you. You can't get him to break his promise by your disobedience. No one else acting outside of you can get him to change his promise. So Christ is, as the song says, that's based on this passage, a solid rock, precisely because he does not change and cannot be blown to and fro by the wind. He cannot be rocked by the waves of changing opinion, of fickle emotion. Nothing can change him. And if he could be changed, then he would not be an anchor. He would not be a solid rock. And so in a world that is telling you what to think without telling you why, Christians go to Scripture, they go to God to be told and to learn what is right and what is good and what is true. And we have those things set in stone. And that stone is God's unchanging nature. So compared to the world, man, God's commitment to justice, God's promise to right every wrong, to wipe every tear, to fix every broken thing in the world, those commitments don't come and go with his emotional reactions to what he sees. He doesn't suddenly care about justice when he sees injustice happen. God hates seeing injustice, but he hates it because he is committed to justice in the depths and core of his unchanging essence. And that is infinitely different than the way that our culture creates our values. And in a personal sense, his love for you doesn't change or depend upon your lovableness on a given day. God loves you because of the love that is rooted in his eternal, unchanging essence. And so when you doubt God's love for you because of you, immutability is the reason that you can say, no. I may have made mistakes. I may be having a bad day. I may be a prodigal son who needs to come back to God. But at the end of the day, that doesn't change God's love for you, because God's love for you isn't about you. It's about his decision, his eternal decision to love and pursue and care for you. And so, sorry, this is not Sermon Thursday. I kind of started preaching at you there for a second, but it's because this is where the rubber meets the road in theology, where it really starts to matter. As that tweet said, you do not want to worship a God whose mind you might succeed in changing, because that's a God who could be talked out of loving you. And this God won't be. And so you have, as the author of Hebrews says, a hope, a sure and steadfast anchor for your soul. And it's rooted in the fact that God doesn't change. And so I want to encourage you to wrestle with this, because when it feels on an intuitive level like a negative thing, like, wait, what do you mean God doesn't respond to my actions and that's what makes him feel an emotion? I'm convinced that at the deepest level, what you and I need and want is a God whose love for you is rooted in his goodness, not yours. His goodness, not your lovableness. And so lean into that, dig in. Don't be afraid to ask questions. I want to talk about this and engage on it. If there's passages of the Bible where you're thinking like, well, what about this? Send them to me and we'll get into them next week. If there's enough questions, we could do a whole episode of that. But my guess is that we'll be able to do it in kind of the first half of next week's episode. So again, I'm sorry that I couldn't be with you guys live. I miss having you here for this. Next week I'll be back live. And thank you for being here. Thank you for watching. Hang tight. Love you guys. God bless.